You are so photogenic.
Thank you so much, Mitzi Perdue. That is probably the best compliment to start this interview coming from you. You are so lively, you're so beautiful, you are so accomplished. A speaker, an author, and now you're writing about someone else, uh, a book called Relentless. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, I'd like nothing more than to share about it. Oh, the book Relentless is about the one of the co-authors of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series, and they're in the Guinness Book of World Records for selling, drum roll, 500 million books.
Wow.
I mean, and there's an amazing story behind the Chicken Soup for the Soul series because, and I bet a good number of people in our audience know of the book because it's been translated into 57 different languages. The story behind Chicken Soup for the Soul is that Mark Victor Hansen and his co-author Jack Canfield were turned down 143 different times. They spent 14 months trying to get a publisher, and they even hired a super duper expensive agent to help them. And a few months into it, he fired them. And who's ever heard of an agent firing his client? But their agent fired them, but they just didn't give up. So part of the title of Relentless is what it took for a writer to achieve success of that at that level.
And and can you tell us about the Chicken Soup series? Obviously, so many of us are familiar with it. There's Chicken Soup for the Soul for children, even and kids as well. Many grew up with it, but there's a generation that's not familiar with it at all, at all. So for those that don't know, and Relentless is such a fitting title, with this backstory. But what is it about?
All right, Chicken Soup for the Soul, which, and I'm writing about I have written a biography of one of the authors of it. But the book Chicken Soup for the Soul itself began in the 1980s. And Mark Victor Hansen and Jack Canfield, they're both premier public speakers, just top of their game. And one of the things that made them just so great as speakers was that they had all these wonderful, inspirational, uplifting, I can do it stories. And one day, when they were talking with each other, Jack Canfield suggested to Mark Victor Hansen, why, my audience is always asking me for, have you ever written down any of these stories? And Mark Victor Hansen said, gosh, my audience is always asking me, have I written these down? Because people wanted to share them with their relatives, their coworkers, their church, whatever. And so the two decided to write a book based on inspirational, redemptive stories, people who were just in a world of trouble, who managed, through one way or another, to get it all back together again and proceed or get on with their lives. Well, the book that I wrote on this, Relentless, it's almost an example of Chicken Soup for the Soul. It's somebody who went through a lot of problems and just didn't give up. And Relentless, it's, we're talking about Chicken Soup for the Soul, but the stories in Chicken Soup for the Soul were so inspirational that that as I said, they've sold 500 million books. People would buy one book and then they'd quickly go buy 5 or 10 more to give to their friends. So it's a publishing phenomenon. Mark Victor Hansen is still in the Guinness Book of World Records for selling more nonfiction books than anybody else, along with his co-author.
Wow. Well, you yourself have an incredible lens through which you look at Mark and this book as well, his success. Your father was the president and co founder of the Sheraton Hotel Chain. Your husband was the chicken magnate Frank Perdue. And you yourself, as I mentioned in the very beginning of our discussion, you are an advocate for human rights, you're a speaker, you're an author. And, all through your career, it seems that you have tried to inspire people to do better, to become better, and to, follow the path of success, as cliche as that sounds, but it almost seems like it's true. So, I guess my question is, what motivated you to write this book? Considering the fact that you've written so many, you've had so much success yourself. I mean, it almost seems like you yourself and the people around you were relentless.
Well, first of all, I love the question. The answer comes partly from the fact that I have a lifetime fascination with people who have just lived up to their potential, people who just charged ahead and did it and became all that they could be. And my father, in founding the Sheraton Hotels, he overcame, I think, one of possibly the worst handicap that somebody in the hospitality industry could have. His handicap was that, well, at age 26, he went to a career guidance counselor to find out why he couldn't hold a job. And the career guidance counselor told him, "You have the worst human relations skills I've ever come across." He spent 8 hours testing father and finally concluded, that he was really bright, but that he was just at the bottom of the heap as far as understanding what motivated people. And he said, the career guidance counselor told my father, "You are a smart fellow. You could have a career as a scientist, in working at a bench somewhere, not interacting with people." Well, my dear father took that as a challenge, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand human nature. He took psychology courses, public speaking courses, salesmanship courses. He was kind of relentless in overcoming what is really a terrible handicap if you have no human relation skills. He got so good at it, his greatest weakness became his greatest strength. And he ended up in the hospitality industry, and he started with one hotel and ended with 400 at the time of his death. So I was fascinated by his story. But then my husband, Frank Perdue, had a somewhat similar story. He started out a very shy farm boy, and at the end of his death, he was employing 20,000 people. So I got to see up close and personal how those two did it. And
Mhm.
then when I met and became friends with Mark Victor Hansen, uh, I began wondering how many of the things that made Frank a success and that made my late father a success, how many of these things do they have in common? And if I can have a side little bar for a second, and that is, what is success? And to my mind, both my father and my husband were, they founded mega companies, but
Yeah.
they were also community men. I think they were beloved in their communities, and they were good family men. So to me, success is having it all.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting. Was your late husband also somewhat of an introvert as well? Would it be fair to say your father was?
I would say that to the end of his days, he was possibly even more introverted than my father. For example, he hated public speaking, and if there was an occasion that required a speech, I'd, I'd be the one who would do it, because he just, and and even socializing with people, he could do it, and I think he did it brilliantly, but it cost him. It didn't come natural. And I define introverted people as people who aren't energized by being with crowds of people.
Mhm.
That's my own definition. And
Right.
going by that definition, Frank was a huge introvert, but he overcame it sort of the same way that my father overcame his weaknesses. And I love stories about people who just hang in there, and they get kicked in the teeth and knocked down, and they pull themselves back up again and keep on.
Right. No,
And
that's very interesting. Go ahead, please.
oh, I'm being a bad guest because it's rude to monologue. Forgive me.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, it's extremely inspiring. And the reason I asked that was because, it seems where inspiration lacks with all three of these individuals that you talk about, then discipline comes in. And do you think that would be a fair assessment? That with,
Yeah.
were they always inspired, or do you think it was their discipline? Was there sort of somewhere
All
in
right.
the
My impression of all three men was that they were extraordinarily disciplined. And I think another word for that is conscientious.
Mhm.
They just keep plugging ahead, and they didn't get discouraged. And it's kind of I'm taken aback by the coincidence that there are three men who, all three of whom overcame terrible obstacles. In the case of Mark Victor Hansen, he was a bright fellow also, and he was always very outgoing, but uh, we're talking like maybe late 70s, early 80s. He went bankrupt. He had hoped that he was going to. This was his dream of glory, that he was going to change the world by building inexpensive housing with geodesic domes from Buckminster Fuller. Well, it didn't work out. He went bankrupt. And he was so low at this point that he was wondering, do I even want to live? I've let down all my investors. I've let down my family. Uh, I'm basically homeless. I'm camping out uh, in the house of four friends and sleeping on the floor outside of one of my friends' bedrooms. And that's pretty low, right? When, when
Wow.
yeah, you would hope to save the world, and here you are sleeping on the floor. Uh, so, how did Mark pick himself back up again and in the end become one of the world's most successful speaker and one of the world's most successful authors? And that's what my book's about. Because, I mean, I'll give an answer to that. I'm not going to hold out on you. But,
Okay, I was waiting.
but I do think that inspiration is one of the biggest gifts one person can give another, because it gives you the energy and the motivation and the direction. And Mark Victor Hansen, what he did when he was at his lowest point, wondering, I've let down all my friends, all my investors, all my relatives. Do I deserve to live even? And he did something that I think I'd recommend to anybody else who's in that situation, or if you ever get in that situation. So, like in the middle of the night, he's tossing and turning, can't sleep, and thinking of everything that's gone wrong in his life. Ah, I'm visiting my sister. I hope that goes away. I'm going to take my laptop to a different room to continue this so that we don't have to.
No problem at all.
All right, back to the answer of what Mark did in the middle of the night that turned his life around. He asked God, but he would be perfectly content with somebody just to go deep inside yourself and ask this question: what am I here for? What do I really want to do with my life? And the answer that he got was a question: what do you really want? And the answer to that question just turned Mark's life around. He didn't want to be a businessman. What he really wanted to do was to talk with people and maybe even inspire them about things that really matter. He dumped his career as a businessman and started learning how to be a public speaker and eventually a writer. But the worst point in his life was kind of a pivot point, which brought him to the best point in his life. And I like that story because, bad as things are, well, take my father, and he's unable to hold a job, and one of the worst things that could happen to him. Uh, and I should explain just a little second more about what one of the worst things that happened to him that made him go uh, to the career guidance counselor.
Right.
He had gotten engaged to my mother, and my mother came to meet her future mother-in-law, and her future mother-in-law said, "Don't marry Ernest. He can never stick to anything. You'll end up poor." And mother said, "I don't care. I love him." So they did get married, but that was the total failure that led him to go to the career guidance counselor, that led him to think, oh, that's what's wrong with me. I'll fix it.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah, and back to what Chicken Soup for the Soul is all about. It's redemptive stories. It's stories about people who've had, whether it's terrible illness problems or relationship problems, or, the world has a great abundance of things that can cause us pain.
Yeah.
And Chicken Soup for the Soul is inspirational. It gives you kind of that hope and that direction to keep trying and not give up. And you're not alone. Other people have gone through horrible things, and they've somehow just, hanging on by their fingernails, managed to keep on.
Yeah. Yeah, we need more of those stories right now, especially when I think that, it's interesting because we're talking about a generation of individuals that are somewhat, they lived during the same time period. And I'm wondering, if we're seeing that kind of relentlessness, if you may, and inspiration today as well. And I think we are, and in some ways, these are the stories of the American dream, if we think about it. And I think they're all alive and well, if we look across America. And we do have an international audience right now, but I think these are very unique. These are very unique stories that I think are very inspirational, very American. I think a lot of immigrants come here and they look at these stories and they get inspired by them, but I don't think they're told enough. So that's why I think Relentless is so important.
I've gotten
Because we don't talk about them enough. I think we talk about our problems a lot more than we talk about our solutions. We talk about what we're against a lot more than we talk about what we are for.
oh,
So, would you say that this is what Relentless is more gearing towards?
okay, I'm loving it because I feel that you nailed why I wrote it. Uh, I wrote it because I think people need inspiration, and the organization of the book is there. It divides Mark's life into like 10-year segments, and for each one of them, he had things that were going wrong, and he had ways of relentlessly going about fixing them. And at the end of each chapter, I have like 5 or 6 quotes from Mark that I think if you follow even one of them, your life is going to be better. And I'll back up for a second and say the context of my thinking that you can make somebody's life better by a book, and that is it's a Buddhist saying that attitude is everything.
Uh-huh.
And if you can get, I'm making this up as I go along, but if you can get like a vitamin injection of inspiration, uh, your life is going to be easier.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. I would like that vitamin
Well,
injections.
there's a book that I recommend to
Some
you.
days I need them more than others.
Yeah, it's on Amazon, and um, and it's also part of the online book club. And I've been getting reviews that one person, bless that person. I wonder if they're single. I want to marry him. Uh, he says that it's a book for the ages.
I
Uh,
love that. You know,
so
I want to talk about, and I love how Mitzi, you always bring, this is your quality that you bring, you lift the people around you up. And I want to talk about you a little bit. Can you tell us about some of the recent work that you've been doing? I know we're fortunate enough to, work alongside each other at the Foreign Press Correspondents on the board. Uh, but also you are involved in efforts to combat human trafficking. Uh,
yeah, and something really neat. I've just been invited to come to Kiev in the Ukraine. The head of police there has seen some of the things that I've written on human trafficking. So since our audience right now is the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, boy, there's some neat little benefits that come from being a writer. Uh, this guy invited me to come to Ukraine to write about what the police are doing. And uh, for those who aren't familiar with this, the we all know about what the military are doing, and a lot of countries are supporting the Ukrainian military. But something that is hugely important, but I don't think enough people are paying attention to, and I'm inviting you as a writer to have this on your radar. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, one of their targets was law enforcement. They, that in that destroy like communications, that destroy police stations or police buildings. I know in Kiev alone they destroyed 25 police cars. Now, why did they target law enforcement? And the answer is, if you really want to demoralize a country that you're trying to conquer, let lawlessness break loose. Let
yeah.
and and now we are getting into human trafficking. Oh, we know that traffickers, just almost like a magnet, are attracted to war-torn areas because when law enforcement breaks down, they just have a field day. And so I'm going to be going to Ukraine and write about what I see because the the guy, my contact, I have several, but the person I talk with most often, he tells me it's so far worse than you can imagine. And we're talking human traffickers. And instantly, my host's master's thesis was on human trafficking. So he's very receptive to the idea of getting more awareness for this, because with more awareness comes more support for the efforts to combat it.
Yeah, I mean, this is we're talking about one of the most, if not most, vulnerable uh, communities and victims, unfortunately, of war, which are, individuals that are being trafficked, on a daily basis, seriously voiceless. Uh, and the law enforcement that you talk about, I mean, that is such an important issue to consider. You're right. We do think about the military, and as far as I know, I think it's the national police, if uh, there is one, that's taking care of a lot of the cities in and around Kiev, because as you mentioned, a lot of the police departments have been demolished.
Targeted. I mean, how evil, but in a way, how horribly clever of of the invaders to realize that if you want to demoralize a population, go after police.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I for a
absolutely.
sec hadn't thought of it until it was pointed out to me.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Law enforcement is so important, just for any country, and I mean, we see the importance of it. And so, so you're traveling there to write about this aspect of it, and they found you through your writing.
Yes. Yeah,
Hmm.
I had written a story uh, on a guy from Odessa who escaped with his wife, and it's a harrowing story. He tried. Oh, let me tell it in like 1 minute. But he, like a good many of his countrymen, actually he's American, married to a Ukrainian, but he's lived there like 15 or 20 years. So this is his country. Uh, he has a home overlooking the Black Sea, and it's a beautiful. I mean, who wouldn't love a beautiful view of the Black Sea? Until one day, he saw, like, I think he told me 14 Russian warships. The view is it used to be about a beautiful sea, and now there are these menacing warships. But he told himself, as everybody else was telling themselves, this is just Russia bluffing, trying to rattle our cage, trying to scare us. And then shortly thereafter, he began hearing what sounded like the world's loudest thunderclaps. And he realized that they were shelling his city. And his home right now, he's back in the United States. Uh, but his home, where he married and raised his child, uh, is now smithereens. And the story that I wrote is he became aware in there was 6 weeks when he got out of Ukraine, and he's living in, I think it's Hungary, perhaps maybe it's Romania. Anyway, he's in an East European country, and he's a relatively wealthy man because he's a businessman. He can afford, if I've got this right, that he had to spend $4,800 on hotel bills and meals. But he's looking around for the people who aren't, who've crossed borders, and the only thing they have is their suitcase. And they don't know where they're going to spend the night. They certainly aren't going to be spending it in a hotel room. And the traffickers are just there waiting for them. And so his approach to this is he's spending pretty much everything he's got on pamphlets that tell, particularly women,
Yeah.
because they're the biggest victims. It
Yeah.
could be men, but let's just focus on women for the moment. Say that you're that you're so traumatized that you can't think straight. You have what some people describe as the 1,000-mile stare. I mean, you're just in the middle of PTSD. And some kindly man says, "Oh, you look as if you could use a hot meal. Would you like a place to stay?" And they're never heard from again. That it's a trafficker. and that's just happening on a spectacular scale. So he's created pamphlets that are given to the refugees as they cross the border, talking
Mhm.
about some of the scams that the traffickers are going to use to lure them in.
Wow, what a noble cause. Mitzi, how did you get into the anti-human trafficking work and campaign advocacy?
Okay, I'm going to proudly reveal my age. I'm 81. At
Mhm.
78, I heard a lecture on what human trafficking was. And to me, before that, it had just been words. But this was a description of 12-year-old girls who were raped like, it could be 8 times, it could be 20 times a night. And their life expectancy is less than 7 years because they're going to die of an overdose or disease. Uh, or if they can't bring in more clients, they're going to be sent to have their organs harvested. And I thought, I've never heard of anything more monstrous. I want to use the years that remain to me to do everything I can to combat this. And I started thinking, I'm not going to be able to rescue girls myself. I can't, what could I do? And then I thought, oh, I have some experience in fundraising and I have some experience as a writer. I've been published since 1980 regularly. Uh, I thought that I would use fundraising and writing to do what I could to combat, I think, one of the worst evils on earth.
Mhm. Wow, that's incredible. I just want to thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your big heart, your great work, for being an inspiration to so many people, and to continuing to, speak. So, giving so much hope when there's so little right now in the world. So, thank you for
Well,
joining.
Susan, thank you. And by the way, all royalties from my book, Relentless, are going to go to combat human trafficking, particularly in Ukraine. So it is available on Amazon, Relentless by Mitzi Perdue. And I'd love to hear from people. And one more comment, it's an editorial comment. You're one of the best interviewers I've ever come across. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That means so much to me. You have no idea. It was a pleasure interviewing you, and I'm only as good as my guests, honestly.